There are moments in history when armies do not merely fight against other armies, but against time, hunger, doubt, betrayal, and the weight of the world itself. The Siege of Antioch was such a moment. What unfolded between the autumn of 1097 and the summer of 1098 was not simply a battle for a city, but a struggle for the soul of the First Crusade. A test so savage and so unrelenting that it came close to breaking the greatest military expedition of the Middle Ages. Antioch became a colossal proving ground of endurance. Inside its walls, fear and suspicion rotted like disease. Outside its walls, starvation drove men to desperation. And across the mountains, a relief army marched with the single purpose of annihilating the Crusaders to the last man. That the Crusaders survived seems, even today, almost impossible. Yet they did survive, and in doing so, they reshaped not only the war, but the destiny of the medieval world. This is the story of a siege that devoured armies, toppled empires, and forged legends. A siege where miracles were claimed, betrayals were whispered, and death walked the battlements day after day. A siege where the greatest knights of Christendom found themselves starving, exhausted, and surrounded, yet forced to attack an enemy far larger than themselves. It begins, as all great trials do, with hope and ambition, long before anyone could imagine how dark the road ahead would become. The First Crusade began with sermons and thunder. When Pope Urban II called upon the knights of Europe to march to Jerusalem, he unleashed a tide of fervor unlike anything Christendom had ever seen. From the mountains of France to the plains of Germany, men abandoned lands, debts, and even families to take up the cross. They marched eastward, driven by visions of holy glory and promises of eternal salvation. But between them and Jerusalem lay the walls of Antioch. Enormous, towering, almost mythical in their scale. For centuries, Antioch had stood as one of the great cities of the Middle East, a fortress city guarding the gateway between Anatolia and Syria. Its walls rose for miles, studded with hundreds of towers curling around mountains and valleys like a stone serpent. To the Crusaders, it was less a city than an obstacle carved by giants. Yet they had no choice but to face it. The road south passed only through Antioch. If they could not take it, the crusade would collapse. If they could take it, the path to Jerusalem would open. By the time the Crusaders reached the city in October 1097, their confidence was still high. They had already achieved a miraculous victory over the Seljuk Turks at Dorylaeum, surviving a deadly ambush on the dusty plains of Anatolia. Their spirits were buoyed, their armies swelling with new hope. And as they approached the great fortress city, they believed they would take it quickly. They could not have been more mistaken. The siege they were about to begin would become one of the longest, hungriest, and most desperate struggles of the entire medieval era. When the Crusaders first encircled Antioch, they were confronted by a sight that would have unnerved even the most seasoned soldier. Walls so vast and so high that no medieval army had ever attempted to storm them. These defenses, built by Byzantine engineers centuries earlier, were the pride of the region. They wrapped around cliffs, followed mountain ridges, and plunged into valleys. Towers loomed over every path, every gate, every road. The city's ruler, Yagisian, knew Antioch's strength. He had watched the Crusaders approach with growing unease, not because he feared their courage, but because he feared their persistence. The Crusaders were not raiders, they were not mercenaries, they were not warriors who could be frightened away by a show of force. They were men on a mission they believed divinely ordained, and that made them terrifying. The Crusaders established camp around the city, dividing their forces to cover the main gates. But from the beginning, they lacked one crucial advantage: numbers. Antioch was too large to surround completely. The army of Christendom found itself stretched thin along miles of hostile terrain, unable to seal the city entirely. And the moment they realized that the northern gate could not be blocked, their siege became a nightmare. Every night, under cover of darkness, small detachments slipped out of Antioch to bring in food, grain, and supplies from friendly villages. The city could feed itself. The Crusaders could not. As autumn deepened and the first frost crept across the plains, the Crusaders saw their supplies vanish. Their horses grew thin. Their bread ration shrank to crumbs. Hunger gnawed at the army like a silent predator. By November, the first men died not from battle, but from starvation. Yet the Crusaders did not lift the siege. Pride and faith held them in place, so did fear. They knew that if they retreated now, their entire expedition would unravel. Antioch had to fall, or the crusade was doomed. But they had no way of knowing that the worst had not even begun.
Winter descended upon the siege camp with cruel force. Rain turned the ground to mud, and icy wind sliced through tents made of patched cloth. Food was almost non-existent. The nearby countryside had been stripped bare within weeks. The supply ships expected from Cyprus were delayed by storms. When bread did arrive, it was so scarce that men fought over crusts. When grain was distributed, some soldiers ground it into flour with stones, while others swallowed it raw. Knights who once rode proudly on war horses now stumbled through the mud on foot. Their horses had been slaughtered for meat. Dogs disappeared next, then rats. Hunger warped the boundaries of morality. Chroniclers whisper of darker acts, of men pushed so far beyond their limits that the lines between survival and shame blurred. The crusade was dying. And yet, in the midst of this suffering, resolve stiffened rather than collapsed. Commanders like Bohemond of Taranto and Raymond of Toulouse worked tirelessly to keep the army together. They distributed what little food they possessed. They held councils to maintain order. They preached that starvation was a test, a trial sent by God. The men listened, not because these words fed them, but because they had nothing else to cling to. Inside Antioch, Yagician watched the enemy suffer and felt confident that time was on his side. He sent messengers to surrounding powers, urging them to assemble armies to crush the Crusaders completely. He believed the Crusaders could not endure another month. He was almost right.
By early 1098, the Crusaders realized they could not win the siege by waiting. If they stayed outside the walls, they would starve. If they attacked the walls directly, they would die. The only hope lay in controlling the mountains surrounding Antioch, especially the fortress of Harim and the iron bridge along the Orontes River. Whoever held these positions controlled the flow of supplies. In a series of daring raids, the Crusaders launched attacks that defied their own exhaustion. On freezing nights, bands of knights rode into the hills, ambushing Turkish convoys and seizing grain. They fought battles in ravines choked with snow, battled ambushes hidden behind boulders, and collided with enemy forces at the Iron Bridge in bloody confusion. These victories did not break the siege, but they kept it alive. Each sack of grain taken from the enemy was a day of survival for the army. Each captured herd of animals meant a brief return of strength. Still, for every victory the Crusaders won, another threat emerged. Word arrived that a massive Turkish army under Kerboga, the Atabeg of Mosul, was marching west. Its purpose was clear: destroy the Crusaders utterly. When this news spread through the camp, a chill settled deeper than winter. Antioch had not fallen. The Crusaders had no supplies, and now a second enemy army was approaching, larger and more terrifying than anything they had yet faced. The noose was tightening. Antioch seemed impenetrable. Every attempt to scale the walls had failed. Every gate was heavily guarded. Every path was watched. The Crusaders had no siege engines left, no ladders, no way to breach the city. Victory appeared impossible. And then came a whisper. A rumor passed quietly from soldier to soldier, from knight to commander. A man inside Antioch was willing to betray the city. His name was Firuz, an Armenian convert who commanded one of the towers along the northern wall. Resentful of Yagisyan's rule, fearful for his future, and tempted by the promise of wealth, Firuz sent word to Bohemond that he would open his tower to the Crusaders. It was a proposal so reckless, so unlikely, that many commanders doubted it. But Bohemond did not doubt. He recognized in Firuz a chance that would never come again. On the night of June 2nd, the Crusaders gathered in silence. Under a moon veiled by clouds, a small band of soldiers crept toward Firuz's tower. They carried no torches, they spoke no words. If a single guard spotted them, the entire plan would collapse. Firuz lowered a rope ladder. One by one, Crusaders climbed the wall in tense silence. Their armor scraped lightly against stone. Their breath trembled in the cold air. Inside the tower, Firuz waited in darkness, holding a single lantern. When enough men had entered, they opened the postern gate from within. The Crusaders poured into Antioch. Sleeping guards were cut down, towers were seized, gates were taken. Yagisyan fled the city in panic, abandoning his family and retainers. His flight became a symbol of collapse. His head was later found by local tribesmen and presented as a trophy. By dawn, Antioch, after 8 agonizing months, had fallen. The Crusaders had taken the city, but their ordeal was only beginning.
The moment Antioch fell, the Crusaders realized the terrible truth. They had trapped themselves inside a city with no food, exhausted troops, and no hope of reinforcement. And outside the walls, Kerboga's army was arriving. Within days, the vast Turkish force encircled Antioch. The Crusaders, who had besieged the city for nearly a year, now found themselves besieged. The roles had reversed. The hunters had become the hunted. The Crusaders were in ruinous condition. Their clothing was torn, their armor was battered, their bodies were weakened by starvation. Many knights could barely stand. Others were too sick or wounded to fight. Some wandered through the streets in a daze, unable to believe they had taken the city, only to be trapped inside it. Kerboga knew their weakness. He could afford to wait. The Crusaders could not. Inside Antioch, chaos erupted. Fights broke out over what little food remained. Some soldiers began deserting, fleeing by night through the same cracks in the walls they had entered. The Crusaders' leaders struggled to maintain control, issuing harsh punishments for desertion. Morale was sinking fast. But then, something changed. Something unexpected. Something that historians still debate to this day. A rumor spread that a holy relic had been discovered beneath the city. The holy lance that had pierced the side of Jesus on the cross. The timing was miraculous, or suspicious. Some believed it divine intervention. Others believed it a calculated psychological weapon. Either way, it worked. The relic ignited a fire of hope in the Crusaders that food could not provide. Men who had been too weak to stand began to believe again. A broken army began to heal in spirit, if not in body. Hope returned, just in time for the final battle. On June 28, 1098, the Crusaders assembled for one last desperate gamble. They would march out of the gates and attack Kerboga's army head-on. It was a strategy so bold, it bordered on madness. They were outnumbered, they were starving, they were surrounded. But they had no other choice. The Crusaders formed into 6 divisions. Their leaders rode before them, battered but unbroken. Bohemond, Raymond, Godfrey, Tancred, Robert of Normandy, Robert of Flanders. These were men who had survived a year of hunger, fear, and betrayal. They had taken Antioch through sheer will, and now they would attempt one final miracle. They opened the gate of St. George and advanced. Kerboga watched in disbelief as the emaciated army marched toward him in disciplined formation. He had expected a desperate mob. Instead, he saw an army rekindled with purpose. The battle began with a thunder of hooves. The Crusaders' cavalry, though few in number, struck like lightning. Their infantry followed, shields locked, chanting prayers. The Turkish archers unleashed waves of arrows, but the Crusaders pushed onward, closing the distance, refusing to break. Then something Kerboga had not expected occurred. His own allies, the various emirs and leaders who had joined him, began to desert. They distrusted him, they feared his growing power, and as the Crusaders advanced, they saw an opportunity to let him fall. One by one, they rode away. Kerboga's great army crumbled. The Crusaders turned panic into victory. They smashed into the weakened lines, they shattered the Turkish formation. Kerboga fled the battlefield, his dream of annihilating the Crusade collapsing around him. By sunset, the impossible had happened. The Crusaders had survived. When the Crusaders returned to Antioch, they returned not as starving refugees, but as victors. The city they had taken in desperation was now theirs securely. The siege that had nearly destroyed them had instead transformed them. They were fewer in number now. Many thousands had died, others had deserted or been lost to disease. But those who remained were hardened beyond measure. They had faced starvation and prevailed. They had faced betrayal and endured. They had faced annihilation and triumphed. Antioch became a symbol, a turning point, a crucible from which the Crusaders emerged forged into something greater than before. Yet their journey was far from over. Jerusalem still lay hundreds of miles to the south. More battles awaited them, more sieges, more heartbreak, more triumphs. But after Antioch, nothing would ever seem impossible again. History remembers Antioch not simply as a siege, but as a miracle of endurance. It was a place where armies starved yet refused to break, where fortified walls fell to whispered betrayals, where a starving force trapped inside a half-ruined city defeated one of the largest armies of the age. For the Crusaders, Antioch became proof that their mission had divine favor. For the Middle Ages, it became a story, retold in churches and courts for generations. For the Middle East, it marked the rise of new powers and the fall of old ones. But above all, the Siege of Antioch endures as a reminder of the extremes to which human beings will go when driven by faith, ambition, and survival. A reminder that history is shaped not only by battles won, but by battles endured. A reminder that impossible odds sometimes fall, not to strength, but to resolve. And that in the dust and hunger and terror, outside those ancient walls, an army once walked through the valley of death and emerged into legend.